Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. You guys know what time it is. Time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. Now, for those of you who don't like these form of videos, you saw the title of the video when you clicked on it. You saw it, you clicked on it anyways. You guys know that I have all my training vlogs up every week. I have over 3,000 informative videos. Right? You know I still do the current events. Now, for those of you who do like these videos, please remember to click a like down below to offset those three guys running that dislike bot every single day. Got to balance things out a little bit. We got to bring balance to the force. But I came across a video by Scott Herman over at ScottHermanFitness where he's discussing the deadlift, my favorite exercise. So let's put on my +5 hat of speechcraft and let's talk about this. Now, historically, I have given Scott a very hard time over the above the knee rack pull. And as most people realize, that's actually the only reason I give him a really hard time, because you guys know how strongly I feel about that exercise. There's a whole list of reasons why it's one of the worst exercises ever invented in terms of muscle mass gains, strength gains, damaging equipment, injury rates. Every single real expert out there has spoken out against it. Every single real expert I know has spoken out against this exercise, like real coaches have. So basically only morons perform it. Only morons perform it and teach it. No one else. Literally nobody else. So that's one reason I give Scott a hard time. And if he would just admit he's wrong on that and talk about stuff like he did in this video, he would never have had any problems with me to begin with. Because in this video, he actually discussed real problems with the deadlift. It's one of the big problems that noobs have. I don't always agree that it has to do with the fact that they break up their hamstring and glute exercises, because I don't know what programs people are running, but I don't program my guys that way. My guys do stuff like glute bridges and deficit deadlifts and deadlift variations and all of that, right? We do these things. Glute ham raises, reverse hyperextensions. I don't have people separate hamstring and glute work. So maybe it's a real issue, but since I don't teach people to do that, I've never seen that manifest. He might be right. What he talked about, though, was the fact that a lot of people will almost squat their butt up in the air, and then they use their back to lift the weight off the floor. So essentially the butt comes up and then they deadlift off the floor. And it's usually really exaggerated. It's a very textbook noob mistake, and it's not something anyone really strong is going to do. Because it essentially turns into a stiff leg deadlift, and you can deadlift whatever you can stiff leg at that point. And most of these guys doing it haven't built up enough support musculature to safely stiff leg deadlift 500 pounds, so they're not going to have any real weight on the bar. And notice I said that because no, a 400-pound deadlift isn't real weight. That's kid weight. That's noob weight, unless you're doing speed pulls or something. So the point is, he kind of broke down some fixes for it in terms of exercises that can help. And actually, I think the exercises that he presented are pretty good for this. And the glute bridge, not entirely, but he led with that one. Here, he finished with that one. That was his second one. He led with the deficit deadlift. And that I'm actually going to agree with. And you know what? Let's come back over to the whole discussion of rack pulls versus deadlift variations. The deficit deadlift is the exact opposite of an above the knee rack pull, right? It is the exact opposite extreme. Now, we could surmise, based upon my opinion of the above the knee rack pull, that if it's the worst deadlift variation ever invented, what about the other extreme? Deficit deadlifts. Deficit deadlifts are extremely useful. They're extremely useful. And I'm going to get into in a minute of why they will correct the situation he described, and it's for a slightly different reason than some people might think. It has to do with the fact that it forces you into the bad position you normally are doing with the deadlift, and then teaches you to move out of that position correctly under load, because it forces a different biomechanic pattern, especially if you have more than 2 inches of deficit. But what is it that we're getting out of deficit deadlifts? Well, we're increasing the range of motion, and we're reducing axial loading. So what do you mean reducing axial loading? You have to lift less. Most people are going to deficit deadlift 5 to 10% less than they can pull conventional. That means you're going to get a very similar training effect, and in some cases, since we're slightly extending the range of motion in some of your muscles, you're going to get a larger training effect, right? You're going to get a larger training response, but with less interference with your recovery. See where we're going here? Because what are we balancing? We're always balancing stimulus versus fatigue. And then we have growth time, adaptation time versus recovery time. These are things that we're balancing in our training. So if you take a variation of something like the deadlift and you do a version of it that for some of the muscles involved will give slightly more training stimulus, but it's slightly easier to recover from, well, that's a good thing. So much so that, again, a lot of the same coaches and experts who say the above the knee rack pull is really stupid say the deficit deadlift is probably a superior exercise to even the normal deadlift for hypertrophy purposes. In other words, if you're trying to do blocks of volume that will be considered hypertrophy or higher volume phases of training, the deficit deadlift may be the preferential lift. Deficit deadlift or a snatch grip deadlift might be superior to the conventional deadlift for hypertrophy purposes. Now, not necessarily for the novice lifter, they're their own animal. I'm talking for people who are late novices, early intermediates. There's actually a method to that, and it works, and it does work. And a lot of coaches have noticed that it works. So by promoting this, that's actually a good thing. It's a good thing, assuming you can do it correctly, that you have the mobility to do so. Now, what he pointed out is that it puts you into a lower position. Well, that's the same reason people have that disjointed movement happen to begin with. They go too low on their deadlift. In other words, they try to turn the deadlift into a squat instead of a hip hinge. Now, your first fix is, before you even try the deficit deadlift to do this, is to learn to not drop your hips so low. You drop your hips to the point to where your hamstrings are tight, and then you break off the floor with a hip hinge instead of using your quads to break it off the floor. You don't really actively engage your quads to the same extent as a prime mover on the deadlift until the bar is already in motion. So what happens when people try to do the other, where they use their legs first to break it off the floor instead of using everything at the same time, the back gets delayed. And so usually, a lot of times, if you focus on using the hip hinge part to break it off the floor, you'll actually engage everything simultaneously until you learn to do it subconsciously. So that's usually your first fix. Don't drop your hips so low, and learn to use your hip hinge and your hips to break it off the floor. So that, again, you're using your back, your lower back, all of that to break the weight off the floor. Then you're driving through with the legs. If you learn to do that, it will oftentimes resolve the problem. And oftentimes it's an issue of people not getting tight enough. In other words, they're loose, and since everything's not pulled in tight, their scapula aren't pulled in tight, they're not ratcheted up tight, they haven't pulled the slack out of the bar, what happens? The hips tend to shoot up because everything's loose. That's another issue also for a lot of novice lifters. When you're put into a deficit, it forces you to get tighter, and it forces you to squat lower, and now you're tight in the incorrect squat position, right? You're now tighter in that position. So it forces you to have to drive up evenly in order to get the weight to even break off the floor. Because you can't just do it the other way. It won't work. You can't stiff leg it from that lower position usually, especially if it's a respectable weight for you. It's a heavy weight for you. For a normal deadlift, it would be, a challenging weight that you might only be able to do 5 reps with on a normal deadlift. Is your all-out 5 rep max. You won't be able to break it off the floor in a stiff leg position. So the only way the weight's going to move is if you pull in tighter. And because you have to again, crouch in lower and squat in lower, it pulls you into a tighter position. It teaches you to learn to get tighter, breaking the weight off the floor. Well, that's a beneficial thing. That's a good thing. And it will help rectify that situation, because it will teach you the correct setup to do a deadlift. And it will teach you to learn to be tighter and more explosive off the floor, which means you have to learn to utilize everything simultaneously to get the weight moving so that it's one smooth motion. So it's a good training tool, and I agree with Scott, and I'm glad that he's promoting that in this case. The other thing that he pointed out, and I do want to point out there, he talked about stance width. I'm not going to get into sumo here because you guys know I train sumo these days, but I've done a lot of conventional, and I've done a lot of deficits conventional, and I've done sumo conventional. He talked about foot placement, and he did say on one plate, you might need 2 plates to do a deficit deadlift, and here's what I'm going to say. You do not need 2 plates. The stance that he's using, where you fit on 1 plate, that's the widest stance you need to go. In other words, there's only one reason ever to have your feet wider on a conventional deadlift or a deficit deadlift. Again, that's not a sumo deficit. There's only one reason, and one reason alone, to go with a wider stance than you can fit on a plate. It's that you're really, really, really fat. That's where the wider stance deadlift comes from in powerlifting, and that's the reason a lot of fat powerlifters can't deadlift as much. Like a lot of times you'll see a really fat powerlifter who's got a great squat and his deadlift is really mediocre for his weight. A lot of those, even at the elite level, they all have a big belly. That's why. The belly gets in the way. So because the belly gets in the way of both their legs and their arms, they have to go with a little bit wider of a stance when they go conventional to do what? To get their belly to clear. The belly gets in the way and hits the top of their thighs, and they can't bend down to pick the weight up. They have to spread their legs to get their belly between their thighs. And then that forces their arms out wider. So their stance goes wider and the arms go wider. It ends up taking 50 to 100 pounds off their max deadlift if they're a really strong guy to do that. But there are other situations where they can't deadlift at all because they can't squat down and pick up the bar with a narrower stance. Their belly gets in the way. They can't physically get into the position. It's the only way they can get into the position. If you're not so fat that you can't get into that position, then you don't need to do it that way. You need to keep that stance narrow. You're going to have better leverages. It's going to be more efficient. So what I would say to the people out there, just as a little caveat there, that plate gives you a real good idea of what sort of deadlift stance you should be using for your best leverages. The way that Scott did it on one plate is for guys who aren't morbidly obese. If you're really fat, you still need to deadlift while you're losing weight, but you're going to have to do the wider stance. But that plate test will tell you a lot about your body composition and where you are right now realistically. If you're in a situation where you need 2 plates to do a deficit deadlift because you can't put your feet on one plate and still bend down to pick up the bar, that's a sign maybe you've overbulked a little bit too much. It might be time to trim it down a little bit. Just throwing that out there. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.